The wind tore across the Colorado prairie with the fury of something alive and hungry, stripping warmth from skin and bone with each savage gust. February 1876 had brought the worst winter in living memory, and tonight the blizzard howled like 1,000 wolves circling for the kill. Hazel Brennan knelt in the snow outside the log house that was supposed to have been her home, wrists bound behind her back with baling wire that cut deep enough to paint crimson streams down her frozen hands. She was 23 years old, her dark blonde hair matted with blood from where Martin Leclerc had struck her across the temple with the back of his hand. Her blue calico dress, the one she had worn on her wedding day 3 months ago, hung torn at the shoulder and stained dark across the bodice where her milk had come in. 3 bundles lay in the snow before her, wrapped in feed sacks that bore the stamp of Crow Brothers Grain Company in faded black letters. The sacks moved weakly, and thin cries rose from them, fragile sounds that the blizzard tried to swallow whole. Hazel's daughters, born 2 hours ago in that cold house, with no one to help her but her own bleeding hands and screaming will. 3 girls when the contract had demanded a son. Useless trash. Martin had said, his breath reeking of rye whiskey and rage. Contract says a son, Hazel. 1 son. You give me 3 daughters. He had laughed then, a sound without any human warmth in it, and spat in the snow near her face. Sheriff Crow will know what to do with you. He always does. Then Martin had mounted his bay gelding and ridden toward the main ranch house, leaving her bound to the fence post to freeze. The babies had been crying then. Now the smallest one had gone silent, and that silence terrified Hazel more than the wire cutting into her wrists or the numbness creeping up from her bare feet. She tried to pull her hands toward the nearest bundle, but the wire held fast. Blood made the metal slick, and the pain was a living thing gnawing at her bones. She could not reach her daughters, could not hold them, could not save them. Please, she whispered to the storm, to anyone who might be listening. Please do not let them die. The answer came in the form of a horse emerging from the white curtain of falling snow, a blue roan mare stepping carefully through drifts that came up to her chest. The rider sat tall and still, wrapped in a buffalo cloak that shed snow in thick clumps with each movement. His face was broad and weathered skin the color of fired clay black hair, braided tight and bound with strips of red cloth. A bow of ash wood was strapped across his back, and he carried himself with the watchful stillness of a man who had learned to survive by reading the land and trusting his instincts. Maka, called Red Hawk by the Lakota bands that still moved through the northern territories, was 32 years old and had been tracking an elk herd for 3 days. He had not planned to come within 5 miles of any white settlement. The memory of his cousin Tasunke, shot dead in a Blackthorn saloon 7 weeks prior over a card game gone wrong, kept him to the high country and the hidden places where white men rarely ventured. But the mare had caught the scent of blood on the wind and turned her head sharply toward the valley, nostrils flaring wide. Maka had learned long ago to trust the animal's senses more than his own careful plans. Now he dismounted in a single fluid motion moccasins, landing silently despite the depth of snow. He moved toward Hazel with the deliberate care of a man approaching a wounded animal, not from fear, but from deep respect for pain and what it could make a creature do. "Be still," he said in English, his accent careful and deliberate. "I will not harm you." Hazel's head jerked up, her eyes gray as storm clouds over the Rockies, fixed on him with a desperate mixture of terror and hope so fierce it made her whole body shake. "My babies?" she gasped, her voice cracking around the words. "Please, the smallest one." She stopped crying. Maka knelt beside the bundles without another word. He opened the first feed sack with gentle, practiced hands, revealing a red-faced infant with a dark tuft of hair plastered to her skull. The baby squalled with surprising strength, tiny fists pumping the air. The second sack held a quieter infant, eyes half open and tracking the movement above her with unfocused awareness. But the third bundle lay terribly still. Maka unwrapped the buffalo cloak from his shoulders and pulled the smallest baby free of the rough sacking. She was pale as the snow itself, lips tinged blue, breathing so shallow he could barely see her tiny chest rise. Without hesitation, Maka opened his buckskin shirt and placed the infant against his bare chest, then wrapped the heavy cloak around them both. The baby's skin was cold as river stones in January. He had felt this kind of cold before in the bodies of things that did not survive the night. "What are you doing?" Hazel's voice cracked higher with panic. "She is freezing to death." Maka said, his tone matter of fact but not unkind. "She needs warmth, now." He scooped a handful of clean snow with his free hand and pressed it firmly against Hazel's wrists where the wire had cut deepest. The cold would slow the bleeding, numb the pain just enough. Then he drew a thin blade from his belt, and the kind used for skinning game, and cut through the wire with 2 swift, precise strokes that barely moved the metal against her skin. Hazel gasped as her hands came free. But before she could reach for the other babies, Maka was already placing them carefully in her arms, arranging them inside the torn front of her dress. "Hold them against your skin," he said, meeting her eyes directly. "As close as you can bear. They need your heat." Their eyes met then in the howling dark, a long measuring look that stretched between them like a rope thrown across a chasm. Hazel saw no pity in his face. No judgment, only a grim and calculating assessment of odds and choices. This was a man who understood survival as a series of clear decisions made fast. Maka saw a woman who had been beaten and abandoned with 3 newborns in a blizzard, but whose first coherent words had been for her children, not herself. That told him everything he needed to know about her. "Why are you helping me?" Hazel asked, pulling the babies close as instructed. The warmth of their small bodies against her skin was immediate and overwhelming. "Because the men who did this will come back," Maka said, glancing toward the main house, barely visible through the curtain of snow. "And I do not trust their justice. I have seen what they call justice before." As if his words had summoned them from the storm itself, a lantern appeared in the distance, bobbing and weaving through the drifts. A voice called out, rough and hurried. "Leclerc said to finish it clean tonight. No witnesses means no trouble." Maka's hand moved to the bow on his back, but he knew arrows would be useless in this wind. Instead, he stepped quickly to the mare and drew a Henry rifle from the saddle scabbard, the repeating kind that held 16 rounds and had turned the tide of more than one fight on the frontier. He leveled it toward the approaching lantern and fired once. The glass shattered with a bright pop, plunging the rider into sudden darkness. The answering shot went wide, snapping through the air near Maka's left ear, close enough that he felt the heat of its passage. "Can you walk?" Maka asked Hazel, his voice perfectly calm despite the gunfire. "I will crawl through hell itself if I must." Hazel said, her teeth chattering. "Good answer. But we will walk. Follow me. Stay low." He led her toward a shallow irrigation ditch that ran along the eastern property line, carved by spring snowmelt and now half filled with loose powder. The mare followed without any command, as though she understood the need for silence. Maka placed 2 of the babies in a leather satchel slung across the mare's saddle, cushioning them carefully with the buffalo cloak. The smallest one he kept pressed against his chest inside his shirt, where his body heat would do the most good. "Keep your head below the ditch line." Maka said, his hand steadying Hazel's shoulder with surprising gentleness. His fingers were warm despite the brutal cold, and she felt real strength in them. Not the cruel, punishing strength of Martin's fists, but the steady, reliable pressure of someone who would not let her fall. Hazel looked at him, then really looked past her fear and exhaustion. His breath came in white clouds that hung in the air, slow and even as a drumbeat. His eyes held hers with an intensity that made her forget the wind and the gunfire for just a moment. "What is your name?" she asked. "Maka. It means earth in my language, but white trappers call me Red Hawk because of my bow." "I am Hazel. Hazel Brennan from Liverpool." She paused, her voice bitter. "I was supposed to be Hazel Leclerc." "You are Hazel who will live through this night," Maka said. "Now move." They dropped into the ditch as another shot cracked through the storm, and the blizzard swallowed them whole. Behind them, men's voices shouted back and forth, organizing a search. But the snow was falling so thick now that tracks disappeared within minutes, and Maka knew these prairies in ways the ranch hands never would. He led Hazel east through the darkness, following the contours of land he could read by touch and instinct, moving away from Blackthorn and toward the one place he thought might offer sanctuary. 3 days before Maka found Hazel kneeling in the snow with her dying daughters, he had been a man mostly content with solitude and the rhythms of the wild country. The high valleys between Blackthorn and the Wyoming line offered everything he needed to survive elk in the pine groves, beaver in the clear streams, and enough distance from the settlements that white men generally left him alone unless they had specific business with him. That business was usually trade his meat and furs for their coffee ammunition and the occasional bottle of whiskey he used for wounds and cold nights. But solitude required resources, and resources required occasional contact with civilization, however grudging that contact might be. Dr. Edward Finch kept a small cabin on the ragged eastern edge of Blackthorn, far enough from Main Street that the more particular townsfolk did not have to watch the parade of desperate humanity that showed up at his door. Edward was somewhere past 40, lean as a whip, with wire-rimmed spectacles that sat perpetually crooked on his nose, and hands scarred from years of setting broken bones and digging bullets out of flesh that often did not survive the extraction. He had come west after the war between the states, carrying the haunted eyes and steady hands of a man who had seen too many field hospitals and too much suffering to ever fully wash the blood from his memory. Maka approached the cabin in the slanted light of late afternoon, leading the mare by braided reins. 2 elk haunches hung from the saddle wrapped in canvas and already beginning to freeze in the February cold. Good meat. Fair trade. Edward opened the door before Maka could knock, as though he had been watching for him. "Figured you might show up before the storm hit," Edward said, stepping aside and gesturing Maka inside. "Blizzard coming tonight. Big one, according to the trappers. You will want to trade and get back to high country before the passes close." Maka nodded and brought the meat inside. The cabin smelled of carbolic acid old coffee and the peculiar metallic scent of blood that never quite left a doctor's home, no matter how much scrubbing was done. A woman sat near the cast-iron stove, mending a heavy wool coat with quick, efficient stitches. She looked up when Maka entered, her face lined but handsome in a stern way. Gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that allowed no nonsense. "Maud Finch," Edward said by way of introduction. "My late brother's widow. She teaches at the schoolhouse when the town council remembers to pay her. Widow Finch will do just fine," the woman said crisply, setting down her sewing and standing to offer Maka her hand. He shook it, genuinely surprised by the firmness of her grip. "Edward tells me you bring the finest venison this side of the Continental Divide. The elk are fat this season," Maka said simply. "They found good grazing before the snows came." Edward examined the meat with a practiced eye, then disappeared into the back room. He returned carrying a tin of real coffee, not the chicory substitute most folks drank, a full box of metallic cartridges for the Henry rifle, and a small brown bottle of quinine that would be worth its weight in gold come summer fever season. "Fair trade?" Edward asked, meeting Maka's eyes directly. "More than fair. Maka said, respect in his voice. Maud poured coffee for the three of them in tin cups that had seen better days. As they drank in comfortable silence, Edward leaned back in his chair, with the particular posture of a man about to share a burden he had been carrying alone too long. There was trouble in town 4 days ago. Edward began carefully watching Maka's face. A young woman came in on the Denver stage. Mail-order bride, English by her accent, maybe 23 years old and 8 months pregnant. Maka said nothing, but his attention sharpened like a blade being stropped. Her name is Hazel Brennan, Edward continued. From Liverpool by way of New York and a dozen railroad towns. She answered an advertisement placed in Eastern newspapers by Martin Leclerc, who works as foreman at the Crow Ranch. They were married by proxy before she ever set foot in Colorado. Some judge in Denver signed the papers based on letters and a payment. Happens often enough out here, Maud said, her voice heavy with bitter knowledge. Men want wives, but cannot be bothered with the time or expense of proper courtship. So they order them from catalogs, like Montgomery Ward Furniture. Pay the passage, sign the papers, and expect a woman to step off the train, ready to cook and bear children, and ask no questions about anything. Edward sipped his coffee slowly. Leclerc's contract was unusual, though. I have seen a few mail-order marriage agreements. Usually they are simple affairs promising home and support in exchange for wifely duties. But this one had specific terms. Payment of $200 contingent on delivery of a male heir within 1 year of marriage. I saw the document myself when Hazel came to me with questions about it. Valentine Crow himself witnessed the signature as a legal officer of the territory. Maka's expression did not change, but his hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the tin cup. Valentine Crow was the sheriff of Blackthorn and 3 surrounding counties, a man who wore a silver star and carried an ivory-handled Colt revolver, and who had ruled this corner of Colorado territory with a combination of legal authority, family money, and ruthless pragmatism for the better part of a decade. His brother-in-law owned the largest cattle operation in the region, and between them they controlled most of the land, water rights, and economic opportunity within 100 miles. What happens if the woman delivers a daughter instead of a son? Maka asked quietly. Edward and Maud exchanged a long look, weighted with shared knowledge and worry. I do not know for certain, Edward admitted, but I have fears. Bad ones. 3 months ago. Maud added, her voice dropping lower. Another mail-order bride came through Blackthorn. Catherine Marks from Boston, educated woman about 30. She married a miner named Tom Hollis, who worked a claim up near the Wyoming line. Pretty thing with red hair and freckles. Edward picked up the thread. Catherine went into labor early. Tom brought her here in the back of a wagon, half out of her mind with pain. The baby was breech-coming feet first. I managed to turn it and deliver the child alive. A healthy boy with good lungs. Tom was beside himself with joy, Maud said. Paid Edward in gold dust and rode off that same night with Catherine and the baby. Said he wanted to get home before another storm hit. Edward's face darkened. 2 weeks later, I saw Tom in town. He was drunk at the Silver Bell Saloon, buying drinks for half the bar. I asked after Catherine and the baby. He paused, his jaw working. Tom said Catherine died of puerperal fever 3 days after getting home. Said the baby was living with a family in Deadwood who wanted a son and could pay for one. The room fell silent, except for the crackle of wood in the stove. You are saying he sold the child? Hazel said, her voice barely above a whisper. I am saying the story did not sit right with me, Edward replied carefully. The timeline was wrong. Puerperal fever takes longer to kill than 3 days, and a man does not usually sell his dead wife's baby that quickly unless something else is happening. So I followed Tom the next time he came to town. Maka leaned forward slightly. And he rode out to the Crow Ranch and met with Martin Leclerc and two men I did not recognize. They loaded a crate onto a freight wagon, labeled it as tax supplies. But I heard a baby crying from inside that crate. I am certain of it. Tarnation, Maud breathed. After they left, Edward continued. I found a shipping tag in the mud where the wagon had been. It had initials on it, VC, and a destination Deadwood, Dakota territory. Valentine Crow. Maka said, his voice flat and cold. Edward nodded. I have no legal proof, nothing that would stand up in a court. But I believe Crow and his associates have been running a scheme for some time now. They recruit women through mail-order arrangements, get them pregnant under contract, and then sell the baby's boys, especially to mining camps and frontier towns where men outnumber women 20-1. Orphans and healthy infants fetch good prices in those places. People ask few questions. And what happens when a woman gives birth to a daughter? Hazel asked, though she already knew the answer in her gut. Then the contract is void, Maud said quietly. And the woman becomes a liability who knows too much. The wind outside picked up, rattling the shutters. Maka stood and moved to the window, his instincts prickling. Something felt wrong. That young English woman you mentioned, he said to Edward. Hazel Brennan. Where is she now? Out at the Leclerc custody guardianship by contract, at least on paper, Edward said. She was due any day when I saw her last. I offered to attend the birth, but Martin refused. Said his wife would manage fine on her own, the way frontier women always do. Maka's jaw tightened. He had a sudden powerful urge to ride out to that custody guardianship by contract, at least on paper right now, storm be damned. But he forced himself to think clearly. The blizzard was already starting, and riding blind into a situation he did not fully understand would help no one. If she gives birth to a daughter, Maka said slowly, what will they do? I do not want to think about it, Edward said, but I fear we will find out soon enough. Hazel Brennan had crossed an entire ocean and half a continent to reach Colorado territory, and she had done it with hope wound tight in her chest, like a spring under pressure. Liverpool had been coal smoke and narrow cobblestone streets, and the sound of her father's lungs rattling in the tiny flat they shared with two other families. When the consumption finally took him, there had been nothing left, no money, no family, no prospects, except the workhouse or the streets, and Hazel had seen what became of young women in both those places. The advertisement in the Liverpool Mercury had seemed like divine intervention, seeking respectable Christian woman for marriage. Colorado rancher. Good home provided passage paid in full. Preference for strong constitution and moral character. Inquire by post. She had written back that same evening, her hand shaking, as she formed the careful letters. The reply came 3 weeks later, with a train ticket, $40 in cash for traveling expenses, and a proxy marriage certificate to be signed in Denver before the final leg of her journey. Martin Leclerc's letter had been brief and businesslike. I need a wife who can work and bear children. The land here is hard but honest. If you are strong and willing, we will do well together. It had not been a love letter, but Hazel had not expected one. She was a practical young woman who understood that survival often mattered more than romance. She signed the papers, boarded the ship, and spent 2 weeks in steerage vomiting into a bucket and praying she would not die before reaching America. The journey west had been a blur of rattling trains, rough coach rides, and towns that looked increasingly raw and unfinished the farther she traveled from civilization. She had married Martin Leclerc by proxy in a Denver courthouse, standing before a judge who smelled of tobacco and whiskey, while a clerk she had never met signed as witness. The judge had her sign 3 copies of the marriage certificate and one additional document that he said was standard for frontier marriages, something about terms and conditions. Hazel had barely read it, too exhausted and overwhelmed to process legal language. Martin met her at the Blackthorn Depot on a cold November afternoon. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and fair hair going gray at the temples features. That might have been handsome if not for the hardness around his mouth and the way his eyes traveled over her body like he was inspecting livestock at auction. "You are smaller than I expected," he said by way of greeting. "I am stronger than I look," Hazel replied, lifting her chin. He grunted. "You better be. That contract you signed says you owe me a son within a year. I already paid your passage, the marriage fees, and a deposit to Sheriff Crow. You fail to deliver, there will be consequences. Understand?" Hazel had not understood, not really, but she nodded because she had nowhere else to go, and winter was coming. They rode to the ranch in silence through country so vast and empty it made her chest ache. The log house Martin brought her to was small, but well built, with a stone fireplace and a sleeping loft. He left her there with a sack of cornmeal, a side of bacon, and instructions to keep the place clean and have supper ready when he came by. "Where will you be?" Hazel asked. "At the main house with the other hands. I will come by when I have need of you. Otherwise, stay here and do not make trouble." He visited 3 times in the first week, always at night, always reeking of whiskey. He did not speak to her, except to give orders or criticisms. When he learned she was pregnant 2 months later, he smiled for the first time since she had met him. "Good. That is what you are here for. Just remember, boy, not girl. Contract is very clear on that point." Hazel tried to ask what would happen if the baby was a girl, but Martin silenced her with a look that made her stomach turn to ice. The pregnancy was difficult. Hazel was sick most mornings, her body adjusting to the altitude and the harsh climate. Martin's visits became less frequent as her belly swelled, and by January he had stopped coming altogether except to drop off supplies once a week. She was utterly alone in that house, with no neighbors close enough to hear her if she screamed, and no idea how she would manage childbirth when her time came. The labor started on a February morning when the sky was the color of old iron and promised snow. The pains came hard and fast, doubling her over with their intensity. Hazel screamed for help until her voice gave out, but there was no one to hear. She delivered the first baby herself, cutting the cord with a kitchen knife she had held in the fire to clean. A daughter. Then the second came another girl. And finally, the third, so small and pale that Hazel feared she was already dead. She had wrapped them in whatever cloth she could find, pressed them against her skin for warmth, and wept with a combination of overwhelming love and absolute terror. 3 daughters. The contract had specified a son. Martin arrived an hour later, coming to check on her, as though he had somehow sensed the birth. When he saw the 3 babies, his face went white with rage. "Daughters." He grabbed Hazel by the hair and dragged her off the bed. "All 3. Please, Martin, they are your children." He struck her across the face, hard enough to split her lip. "They are your failure. I paid good money for a son, and you give me 3 useless girls." He had dragged her outside into the gathering storm, bound her wrists with wire, and left her kneeling in the snow with her daughters dying beside her. The last thing he said before riding away was that Sheriff Crow would know what to do about the situation. Now following Maka through the blizzard with her babies clutched desperately against her chest, Hazel understood with perfect clarity that she had been brought to Colorado not as a wife, but as livestock. Her only value had been her womb, and having failed to produce the correct product, she and her daughters were now liabilities to be disposed of as efficiently as possible. But she was not dead yet, and neither were her girls. They reached Dr. Finch's cabin just as full darkness fell. Maka pounded on the door with the side of his fist, and Edward opened it immediately, his face going pale when he saw them. "Merciful heavens," Edward breathed. "Get inside, quickly." The warmth of the cabin hit Hazel like a physical blow. Her knees buckled, but Maka caught her before she could fall, guiding her to a chair near the stove. Maud appeared from the back room, took one look at the situation, and immediately began issuing orders with the calm efficiency of a woman who had raised 4 children and buried 2. "Edward, get your bag." "Maud, we need clean watercloth for bandages and milk if you have any," Maka said, carefully extracting the babies from Hazel's arms and his own shirt. "I have goat milk," Edward said, already moving. "We can fashion feeding rags." Maud took the 3 infants with practiced hands, quickly assessing each one. 2 are strong enough, but this smallest one. She held up the pale baby Maka had been warming against his chest. "Her lungs are weak. She needs warmth and feeding, but gently. Too much too fast will kill her." Edward cleaned and bandaged Hazel's wrists, while Maud worked on the babies, fashioning makeshift nursing bottles from clean cloth soaked in warm goat milk. The smallest baby drank weakly but steadily, and some color began to return to her tiny face. Maka stood by the window, his rifle within easy reach, watching the storm outside. Every few minutes, his eyes would sweep the darkness, looking for the bobbing lights of lanterns or the movement of horses. His whole body was coiled tight with alertness. Hazel watched him from her chair, noting the way he held himself perfectly still, but ready to explode into motion at any moment. Like a wolf on a ridge watching for threats. "Why did you help us?" she asked again, her voice stronger now that warmth and safety had given her back some measure of composure. Maka turned from the window. "Because I know what men like Leclerc and Crow do to those they consider property. I have seen it before." "Your cousin?" Edward said quietly. "Tasunke. He told me once that he had been to the reservations, seen how the government treats your people when they decide to relocate them or when treaty payments disappear. My cousin is dead because a white man did not like losing at cards," Maka said flatly. "Shot in the back. Crow ruled it self-defense and let the killer walk free because Tasunke was Lakota and therefore did not deserve justice." His eyes found Hazel's. "I will not let them do the same to you and your daughters. Not if I can prevent it." Before Hazel could respond, Edward stepped back from treating her injuries and folded his hands on the table. "You need to understand what you are facing," he said. "Both of you." He told them about Catherine Marks, about the baby sold to Deadwood, about the shipping crate, and the tag marked VC. He told them about the contract Hazel had signed and what he believed was happening, a trafficking scheme that used mail-order brides as breeding stock and sold the resulting children to the highest bidder in frontier towns desperate for families. "But that is illegal," Hazel protested. "That is slavery." "It is a gray area of territorial law," Maud said grimly. "Mail-order marriage contracts are legal. And if a woman signs away certain rights without fully understanding what she is agreeing to, well, judges tend to side with the men who pay their salaries, especially judges like Crow." "He is the sheriff," Hazel said. "Is he also a judge?" "Crow wears whatever hat suits his purpose on any given day," Edward said. "Sheriff, judge, land commissioner, and his brother-in-law controls the cattle business. Between them, they run this entire territory." The sound of horses outside cut through the conversation like a knife. Maka moved to the window and swore under his breath. 4 riders, coming fast." Edward moved beside him and looked out. "Crow's deputies. They will have a warrant or some legal pretense." "Do you have a back way out?" Maka asked. Edward hesitated only a moment, then nodded. Root cellar. There is a tunnel built during the war as a storm shelter, but it leads out to the dry creek bed about 50 yards behind the cabin. You will have to crawl, but it will get you out. Maka looked at Hazel. Can you manage that with the babies? Hazel's jaw set in a way that told Maka everything he needed to know about the steel in her spine. Try to stop me. No. Maud quickly packed a leather satchel with food blankets, the goat milk, and clean cloth for the babies. She pressed it into Maka's hands along with a small pouch of coins. Go, she said firmly. Edward and I will delay them as long as we can. We will say you came and left heading north toward Wyoming. That should buy you a few hours. Maka gripped Edward's shoulder hard. Thank you, my friend. Do not thank me yet, Edward said. Just keep them breathing. That is all that matters. They descended through the trap door in the kitchen floor into a cellar that smelled of earth and old potatoes. At the far end, a narrow tunnel had been carved through the frozen ground, supported by rough timber beams that creaked ominously under the weight of soil above. It was barely wide enough for a man to crawl through on his belly. Maka went first, pushing the satchel ahead of him and carrying 2 of the babies tucked carefully inside his shirt. Hazel followed the smallest baby clutched against her chest, her injured wrists screaming with pain every time she had to brace herself against the tunnel walls. The darkness was absolute and suffocating. More than once, Hazel felt panic rising in her throat, like bile, the weight of earth above her, and the narrow walls pressing in until she could barely breathe. Then Maka's hand would reach back through the darkness and find hers, his grip warm and solid and real. One body, one beat, he said, his voice perfectly calm in the suffocating dark. Breathe with me, Hazel. In and out. Follow my rhythm. Hazel focused on his breathing, slow and steady as a drum, and matched her own breaths to his. The panic receded enough that she could move again, crawling forward through the dark. They emerged into the creek bed, gasping and shaking. Behind them, faint through the storm, they could hear raised voices from the cabin. Edward's voice raised in argument, and then the sound of something heavy breaking. They are searching the house, Maka said. We have maybe 10 minutes before they find the tunnel. Move. They ran through the blizzard, Maka leading the way, with an unerring sense of direction that seemed almost supernatural. But it was not magic, it was knowledge earned through years of reading the land. He followed the contours of drainage cuts and the feel of the wind moving east and then north, always keeping to low ground where their tracks would fill faster. After 20 minutes of hard travel, Hazel's legs gave out. She collapsed in the snow, unable to go another step. Maka turned back immediately and knelt beside her. I am sorry, she gasped. I cannot feel my feet anymore. Maka pulled off her soaked leather boots without ceremony. Her feet were pale, the toes beginning to darken with the first stage of frostbite. He cursed in Lakota words Hazel did not understand, but whose meaning was clear, and began rubbing her feet between his bare hands, forcing warmth and circulation back into the frozen flesh. This will hurt, he warned. It did. As sensation returned, Hazel had to bite down on her sleeve to keep from screaming. It felt like her feet were being held in fire. Good, Maka said, still working. Pain means the flesh is alive. No pain would mean we lose the toes. Why are you doing this? Hazel asked through gritted teeth. You could leave us. Save yourself. You owe us nothing. Maka looked up at her, his dark eyes reflecting the white of the snow. I could not leave you, not and remain myself. What does that mean? It means we do not abandon those who cannot protect themselves. That is what makes us human instead of animals. He pulled dry socks from his pack and put them on her feet, then wrapped them in strips of cloth. My people have a saying, mitakuye oyasin. It means all my relations. Everything is connected. Your suffering is my suffering. Your survival is my survival. Hazel felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been frozen and closed since Martin first struck her. This stranger, this Lakota warrior, who owed her nothing, was risking his life to save hers. Not because he expected payment or gratitude, but simply because it was the right thing to do. "Thank you," she whispered. Maka just nodded and helped her to her feet. He fashioned a travois from willow branches and rope, creating a small platform that could be dragged behind them. The babies went into the satchel cushioned with every scrap of cloth they had, and he lashed the whole thing securely to the frame. "Where are we going?" Hazel asked. "Schoolhouse, 2 miles north. Maud said we could shelter there until morning. After that." He shrugged. "We see what dawn brings." They moved through the storm in silence, the wind howling around them like something alive and furious at their refusal to die. Maka navigated by instinct and memory, following the frozen creek bed until it curved north toward a low ridge. On that ridge, barely visible through the white curtain of falling snow, stood a simple clapboard building with a bell tower. They reached it near midnight. Maka broke the door lock with the butt of his rifle, and they stumbled inside, gasping with exhaustion and cold. The interior was frigid, but blessedly dry rows of wooden benches, a blackboard, and a cast-iron stove in the corner. Maka got a fire going with scraps of kindling and old student papers coaxing the flames to life, with the patient skill of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Hazel collapsed onto a bench, the babies crying weakly in her arms. Using the supplies Maud had packed, Maka showed Hazel how to feed the infants properly with cloth teats soaked in goat milk, and how to massage their tiny feet and hands to keep circulation going. His hands were gentle and sure as he demonstrated, and Hazel found herself watching him more than the technique. "You know a great deal about caring for newborns," she observed. "I have helped birth foals and calves," Maka said pragmatically. "The principle is the same. Keep them warm, keep them fed, keep them breathing. Everything else can be solved if those 3 things are managed." Hazel almost smiled despite everything. "That is a remarkably practical view of motherhood." "Motherhood is practical work," Maka said simply. "The love part comes naturally. The survival part must be learned." He moved to the window and scanned the darkness outside, his rifle ready. The storm was beginning to ease slightly, though snow still fell in thick curtains. "They will come at dawn," Maka said. "Crow's men will search every building within 5 miles once the storm breaks enough to travel safely. We have a few hours to rest, but not much more." Hazel looked at him, at the way he stood sentinel by the window, never fully relaxing, always watching. She thought about Martin, who had never once looked at her with anything but calculation and disdain. And she thought about this man, who had appeared out of a blizzard like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to speak. "Why do you hate Crow?" she asked quietly. "It is more than just your cousin, is it not?" Maka was silent for a long time, his profile outlined by the firelight. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and filled with old pain. 6 weeks ago, my cousin Tasunke was shot in a saloon in Blackthorn. The white man who killed him claimed self-defense and said Tasunke had reached for a weapon. Crow ruled it a fair fight and let the killer walk free that same day. Was it self-defense? Tasunke was unarmed. He was shot in the back while leaving the saloon. There were 3 witnesses who said so, all Lakota, all refused testimony by Crow on the grounds that Indians cannot testify against whites in territorial court. Maka's jaw clenched. My cousin died in the street like a dog, and his killer walked free because Crow decided Lakota lives do not matter. "I am so sorry," Hazel whispered. "Sorry does not bring justice." and justice does not exist for men like me in towns like Blackthorn." He turned to look at her. "That is why I help you. Because I know exactly what Crow and men like him are capable of when they decide someone is beneath their concern." Hazel fed the babies, one by one, marveling at their tiny fingers and the way they latched onto the cloth teats with desperate hunger. The smallest one, the one Maka had saved by warming her against his own body, was still weak, but drinking steadily. Hazel felt a fierce surge of protective love so powerful it made her shake. As exhaustion finally claimed them both, Hazel arranged the babies on a bench padded with blankets and lay down beside them. Maka sat with his back against the door rifle across his lap, ready to wake at the slightest sound. Just before sleep took her, Hazel heard his voice low and steady in the darkness. "You are stronger than you know, Hazel Brennan. You will survive this. I promise you that." She wanted to tell him that she was only strong because he was there, that his steadiness gave her something to hold on to when everything else was chaos and terror. But sleep pulled her under before she could form the words. Dawn broke gray, and grudging the storm having passed in the night, but leaving behind a world buried under 3 feet of fresh snow that reflected the weak light in blinding sheets of white. Maka had not slept at all. He stood at the schoolhouse window watching the tree line to the south, where he knew Crow's men would come from if they came at all. They came at mid-morning. Maka counted 6 riders emerging from the pines, moving slowly through the deep drifts. They fanned out in a loose line, searching systematically. One of them dismounted and walked forward, carrying a white cloth tied to a rifle barrel, the frontier gesture for parley. It was Sheriff Valentine Crow himself. Crow cut an imposing figure, even at a distance. He was a tall man in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered and impeccably dressed, despite the weather, in a long black wool coat with a silver star pinned prominently to his chest. He wore a flat-brimmed hat and carried an ivory-handled Colt revolver on his hip in a tooled leather holster. His face was handsome in a hard way, with a neatly trimmed beard going silver at the edges and eyes the cold, pale blue of winter ice. "Maka," Crow called his voice, carrying clearly across the snow. "I know you are in there, you and the Leclerc woman. This does not have to end badly. Send her and the children out, and you can ride free. You have my word as an officer of the law that no harm will come to you." Maka did not respond. Behind him, Hazel had woken and was feeding the babies, her hands steadier now after a few hours of rest. She looked at Maka with a question in her eyes. Crow sighed dramatically, as though dealing with a particularly stubborn child. "Let us be reasonable about this situation. Mrs. Leclerc is legally bound by a valid marriage contract. She and her children are the custody guardianship by contract, at least on paper, of her husband, until the terms of that contract are fulfilled or voided by proper legal process. By taking her, you are interfering with a lawful arrangement. That makes you guilty of kidnapping and theft, both hanging offenses in this territory. There is no law in any civilized land that makes children into custody, such guardianship by contract, at least on paper." Maka called back, his voice hard as stone. "There is a contract properly witnessed and filed with the Territorial Land Office." Crow replied smoothly. "I have a copy right here if you would like to examine it. Everything is legal and above board. This is a simple matter of enforcing legal obligations." Hazel moved to the window beside Maka, her chin lifted defiantly. "That contract was obtained under false pretenses. I was never told that my children would be sold like livestock. The contract specifies penalties for non-performance, Mrs. Leclerc." Crow said, his tone becoming harder. "You agreed to produce a male heir. You failed to do so. The penalties are clearly stated in the document you signed." I did not understand what I was signing. Ignorance of law is no excuse for breaking it. That is basic legal principle. Crow's patience was clearly wearing thin. Now, I am offering you both a chance to resolve this peacefully. Come out and we can discuss the situation like civilized people. Continue to resist, and I will be forced to take more direct action. Maka looked at Hazel, then at the babies sleeping in their makeshift nest. He made a decision. There is a back door, he said quietly. Leads to the woodshed. Beyond that, the children have carved a trench through the snow, been playing in it all winter. It leads to the trees. We go now while they are focused on the front. They will see us, Hazel protested. Not if someone distracts them first. As if on cue, the back door of the schoolhouse burst open, and a half-dozen children came pouring out, students who had been hiding in the woodshed, sent there by Maud the night before as insurance. They ran toward Crow's riders, laughing and throwing snowballs, creating exactly the kind of chaos children excel at. In the confusion, Maka and Hazel slipped out through the woodshed. They moved through the snow trench quickly, the high walls hiding them from view. By the time Crow realized what had happened and sent men around the building, they were already in the trees and moving fast. Behind them, Crow's furious voice carried through the cold air. Find them. I want them found today. Understand? No excuses. They crossed the ridgeline and descended into the valley of the South Platte River, a broad expanse of water that had frozen solid in the brutal cold. The ice was thick, probably safe to cross, but Maka tested it carefully before trusting their weight to it. Behind them, the riders appeared on the ridge like dark cutouts against the white snow. One of them raised a rifle and fired. The shot was at extreme range, but luck favored him. The bullet struck the ice near Hazel's feet, sending up a spray of frozen chips and cracking the surface in a spiderweb pattern. "Run!" Maka shouted. They ran across the ice, the babies clutched tight. More shots rang out, the bullets striking the frozen river with sharp cracks that echoed between the canyon walls. The ice groaned beneath them, a deep grinding sound that spoke of pressures and fractures building in the depths. Hazel felt the surface shift beneath her left foot. Before she could react, her leg plunged through into the black water below. The cold was instant and vicious, like being stabbed with 1,000 knives made of ice. It stole her breath and sent shock racing through her body. Maka grabbed her arm and hauled her bodily back onto solid ice, his strength born of desperation. He half-dragged, half-carried her the rest of the way across the river, while bullets snapped through the air around them. They reached the far bank and collapsed behind a tumble of boulders that provided some cover. Hazel's entire left leg was soaked and already beginning to freeze solid. Maka did not hesitate. He stripped off her boot and stocking, revealing skin that was turning white with terrifying speed. He opened his buckskin shirt and pressed her foot directly against the bare skin of his stomach, holding it there, despite the shock of cold. Hazel gasped, not from pain, but from the sudden intimacy of the act. Maka's skin was warm and solid, and the contrast with her frozen foot was almost painful in its intensity. "I am sorry," she stammered. I did not mean to." "Be quiet and let your foot warm," Maka said, but there was no harshness in his voice. "Modesty is a luxury we cannot afford right now." She looked at him, at his face so close to hers, at the concentration in his eyes as he held her foot against his body and rubbed warmth back into her leg. His hands moved over her calf in firm, deliberate strokes, and she felt heat beginning to return to the frozen limb. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. Thank me when we are still alive tomorrow," Maka said, but his eyes softened just slightly, and for a moment the hardness left his face. Across the river, Crow's men were testing the ice, trying to find a safe crossing point. Maka watched them with calculating eyes. "They will get across eventually," he said. "The ice is thick enough if they spread out. But it will take time, maybe an hour. We need to use that hour well. He wrapped Hazel's foot in dry cloth from the pack and helped her to her feet. They moved north through terrain that grew increasingly rough, broken country of ravines and steep hillsides, where the snow had drifted deep in some places and blown clear in others. By mid-afternoon, they reached a small homestead tucked into a fold of the hills. Smoke rose from the chimney, and chickens scratched in a cleared patch near the barn, despite the snow. A man emerged from the barn as they approached, holding a pitchfork defensively. "Who goes there?" He called, his voice wary but not hostile. "Macaw. We traded meat last fall. You gave me flour and coffee?" The man lowered the pitchfork slightly. "I remember. Red Hawk folks call you." He looked at Hazel and the babies, and his weathered face creased with concern. "What kind of trouble are you bringing to my door this time?" "The kind that follows whether invited or not," Maka said honestly. The man sighed deeply, the sound of someone who had known hard choices before and would know them again. "Come inside. But you cannot stay long. I have a family to think about." His name was George Tiller, and he was perhaps 30 years old, lean and weathered by wind and work. His wife Anna was heavily pregnant, moving slowly around their small cabin with her hand pressed to the small of her back. She took one look at Hazel and the babies, and immediately began heating water and finding clean cloth, asking no questions that did not need immediate answers. "There is a place north of here," Maka said to George quietly. "An old mine near Deadwood. I have heard rumors that Crow uses it. Do you know anything about it?" George hesitated, glancing at his pregnant wife. "I have heard talk. Some say Crow stores freight there, goods being moved to the Dakota mining camps without going through regular channels. No one asks too many questions because Crow controls the freight contracts for half the territory." "Can you tell me how to find it?" "Why would you want to?" George asked. "That kind of curiosity gets men killed out here." "Because I need proof of what Crow is doing," Maka said. "And I think that mine holds the proof I need." George studied him for a long moment, then finally nodded. He drew a rough map on a scrap of paper with a piece of charcoal. "Follow the old freight road north, past Blackthorn. About 10 miles out there is a turnoff marked by a lightning-struck pine tree as dead and white as bone. You cannot miss it. The mine is 5 miles up that draw, but the entrance is hidden by a rockfall. You have to know where to look." Maka folded the map and tucked it carefully inside his shirt. "I am in your debt." "Just stay alive," George said. "And do not lead Crow back here if you can help it. Anna is due any day now, and I need to be here when the baby comes, not running from deputies." Before they left, Anna pulled Hazel aside and pressed something into her hand, a small leather pouch that jingled softly with coins. "It is not much," Anna said quietly, "but it might buy you food or passage somewhere. And listen to me carefully. Whatever happens, do not let them take your children. A mother's love is the only law that truly matters on this earth. Everything else is just men making rules." Hazel squeezed the woman's hand hard, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They left the Tiller farm as shadows lengthened across the snow. Maka led them north along game trails and frozen creek beds, following George's map with careful attention. As they walked, he taught Hazel how to hold the Henry rifle properly, how to brace the stock against her shoulder to absorb the recoil, how to sight down the barrel and lead a moving target slightly. His hands covered hers on the weapon, adjusting her grip with gentle but firm pressure. Their faces were close together as he leaned over her shoulder to check her sight line close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath against her cheek. "Why are you teaching me this?" Hazel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because if something happens to me," Maka said seriously, "you will need to protect yourself and your daughters. Knowledge is survival out here. The more you know, the better your chances. I do not want you to fall, Hazel said, and was surprised by the intensity of feeling behind the words. Maka met her eyes. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the bond forming between them, forged in shared danger and survival. Then we will both need to be very careful, he said softly. They reached the old mine. As darkness fell the entrance, hidden exactly as George had described, behind a rockfall of tumbled boulders and scrub pine. Maka left Hazel and the babies in a sheltered hollow a quarter-mile away, hidden among the rocks. I will be back within an hour, he promised. If I do not return by then, follow this creek bed north. It will take you to the Wyoming line eventually. Find a marshal and tell them everything. Maka. He pressed his hand to her cheek just for a moment. I will come back. Then he disappeared into the darkness. The mine tunnel descended steeply into the earth, its walls shored up with rotting timber that creaked ominously under the weight of stone above. Maka moved carefully, lighting his way, with a pitch-soaked torch he had made from materials in the hollow. The tunnel opened after 50 yards, into a wider chamber that had been excavated years ago, and now served some other purpose than mining. Wooden crates were stacked against the walls, each one marked with different shipping companies and destinations. Maka pried open the nearest crate with his knife. Inside were blankets, tinned food, a bottle of laudanum, and at the bottom a bundle of papers tied with string. He untied the bundle and began reading by torchlight. They were contracts, dozens of them, all identical in format to the one Hazel had signed. Mail-order marriage agreements with specific clauses about producing male heirs with payment schedules and penalty provisions. But there was more bills of sale receipts correspondence between Crow and various buyers in mining camps throughout Dakota and Montana territories. The documents laid out a system for recruiting women, impregnating them, and selling the resulting children, particularly boys, to frontier settlements desperate for families. Maka found a ledger at the bottom of another crate. It listed names, dates, and payments in careful handwriting. Most entries were marked fulfilled with a payment amount. A few were marked void or disposed of, with no further detail. Those last entries made his blood run cold. He was turning pages quickly, scanning for anything that might prove useful in a court, when he saw a name that made his heart stop. Wichapi, age 16. Delivered to Deadwood Mining Camp. Payment $200. Buyer Samuel Cord, Wichapi. Morning Star, his younger sister. Maka's hands began to shake. He had not seen his sister in 5 years, not since the winter of 1871, when white trappers had raided their hunting camp and scattered the families. He had searched for months, following rumors and cold trails, but eventually accepted that she was gone, probably dead in the brutal winter or taken so far that he would never find her. But she had not died. She had been taken, traded through hands like livestock, and sold to a mining camp where women were scarce and men paid high prices for companionship, whether willing or not. And Valentine Crow had facilitated the entire transaction. The rage that rose in Maka was white-hot and absolute. His hand tightened on the ledger until his knuckles cracked, and for a long moment he could not breathe through the fury and grief choking him. Then Hazel's face appeared in his mind, Hazel and her 3 tiny daughters. They were still alive. He could still save them, could still stop this from happening to anyone else. That had to be enough. That had to matter. He forced himself to focus, to think tactically instead of emotionally. He carefully tore out the pages listing his sister and several other transactions, then closed the ledger and returned it to the crate. Let Crow think his records were still safe. Maka was turning to leave when he heard voices echoing from the tunnel entrance. He extinguished the torch immediately and pressed himself into the shadows behind a stack of crates. 3 men entered the chamber carrying lanterns. One of them was Martin Leclerc, his face haggard and his movements unsteady from drink. The other 2 were rough-looking types, hired guns by the look of them. One was called Hatchet Harry, a scarred man who carried a long knife on his belt. The other went by Kincaid Younger, but with mean eyes. Crow says to search every building and cave within 10 miles. Martin was saying his words, slurring slightly. That savage took my wife and the brats. If we do not find them soon, Crow will dock my pay for the whole contract. $200 gone because that English witch could not produce a proper son. We will find them. Hatchet Harry said, his voice like gravel. Tracks lead this way. They will be close. Better be, Kincaid added. Getting tired of chasing through snow for your family troubles, Leclerc. They are not my family. Martin spat. They are worthless mouths that cost me money. The 3 men settled near the entrance, passing a bottle of whiskey and talking in low voices about where to search next. Maka knew he had perhaps 5 minutes before they came deeper into the chamber and found him. He was calculating his chances of getting past them unseen when a stone shifted beneath his foot with a soft, grinding sound. The noise was small, but in the silence of the mine, it carried like thunder. Martin's head snapped up. What was that? All 3 men reached for their weapons. Maka moved fast. He kicked over a lantern as he burst from hiding, plunging half the chamber into darkness. Then he was among them, moving with the speed and violence of someone fighting for his life. He drove his shoulder into Hatchet Harry's chest, sending the man sprawling. Martin swung at him with a pistol, but Maka ducked under the blow and drove his knee into Martin's ribs, feeling bone crack. Kincaid came at him from the side, but Maka swept his legs and brought him down hard. Behind him in the tunnel entrance, he heard Hazel's voice, "Maka down!" He dropped instinctively. A handful of gravel flew over his head and struck the remaining lantern, shattering the glass. The chamber plunged into complete darkness. Maka did not need light. He moved by sound and instinct, finding the tunnel by touch and running. Behind him, men cursed and stumbled. A gunshot boomed deafeningly loud in the confined space, and the bullet ricocheted off stone somewhere to his left. He emerged into the night to find Hazel crouched near the entrance, breathing hard. "I thought you might need help," she said. "You should have stayed hidden," Maka said, but there was no anger in his voice, only relief. "And let you die in there, not on my watch." More gunfire erupted from the tunnel. They ran. Behind them, men poured out of the mine entrance, shouting and giving chase. Maka and Hazel fled through the darkness, following the game trail back toward the hidden hollow where the babies waited. They reached it just ahead of their pursuers and grabbed the infants, then kept running north into country Maka knew better than any white man. They ran through the night, and for the first time since this nightmare began, they were running toward something instead of just away. Maka had proof now, proof of what Crow was doing, proof that could bring the whole corrupt system down if they could just get it to someone with the authority and courage to act. And he had a name, Wichapi. His sister was alive somewhere in Deadwood. When this was over, he would find her. He swore it on the blood of his ancestors and the stars wheeling overhead. They traveled hard for 2 days, staying ahead of the pursuit. By moving through terrain, the horses could not easily follow steep ravines, rock slides, dense pine forests where the snow had drifted too deep for mounted men. Maka hunted small game with his bow rabbits and a young pronghorn, which they roasted over small fires built in natural hollows that hid the smoke. The babies were thriving despite the hardships, growing stronger each day on the goat milk Maud had provided. On the 3rd day, they reached the Deadwood Trail just as a late winter storm rolled in. Not snow this time, but cold rain that turned the world into a gray, miserable slog through mud and freezing water. They were exhausted, soaked, and desperate when they saw the burned-out trestle ahead. The railway bridge had spanned a deep gorge, but it had collapsed years ago, burned during some long-ago conflict. Now only the charred timber pilings remained jutting up from the bottom of the ravine like blackened teeth. On the far side, Maka could see smoke rising from a settlement, possibly Deadwood itself, or at least a trading post. But there was no way across except to descend into the gorge and climb up the other side, a journey that would take hours they did not have. Maka checked the mare they had found her the day before, limping but alive, in a meadow where she had taken shelter. The bullet graze on her shoulder was healing, but the animal was exhausted and could not carry them much farther. He made a decision that cost him more than he wanted to admit. He removed the saddle and bridle, running his hand along the mare's neck one last time. "You are a good horse," he told her in Lakota. "You saved us. Now save yourself." He slapped her flank, and the mare trotted away into the willows, heading for water and grazing. Maka watched her go and felt the loss like a physical wound. "She saved our lives," Hazel said softly, understanding. "Yes, now we save ourselves." They descended into the gorge on foot, half sliding down the muddy slope while trying to protect the babies from the worst of it. The ravine bottom was choked with old timber and debris from the collapsed bridge, and they had to pick their way carefully across. They were halfway up the far side when riders appeared on the ridge above them. 6 men led by Valentine Crow, and among them was a man Maka recognized with a sick twist in his gut. Limping Luke, a mixed blood tracker who had once ridden with Maka's band, but had been cast out for selling information to bounty hunters. Luke had chosen survival over loyalty, and now he rode with Crow's posse for whatever gold they paid him. "End of the trail, Maka," Luke called down his voice, carrying easily across the gorge. "Crow is offering $200 for the woman and the brats, and another $50 for your head. That is enough gold to live well for a long time. Sorry, brother, but business is business." Maka did not waste breath on answers. He pushed Hazel ahead of him up the slope, using his body to shield her from the rifles above. Bullets began to kick up mud around them, but the angle was bad, and the slope was steep enough that most shots went wide. They reached the top of the gorge and ran for the only cover available, a rope bridge that spanned an even deeper chasm, a quarter-mile north. The bridge was old, its ropes frayed and boards missing, swaying dangerously in the wind and rain. Maka tested the first few boards. They held barely. "We have to cross," he said. Hazel looked down into the chasm. Far below, a river churned over jagged rocks, white with foam. "That bridge will never hold us both. It will have to." They started across, moving slowly, testing each board before trusting their weight to it. The bridge swayed sickeningly, and the ropes creaked with every step. Behind them, the posse reached the gorge and began firing from the ridge. A bullet struck the rope near Hazel's hand. She felt the fibers snap, and suddenly the bridge lurched sideways. She lost her footing and started to fall, the baby's clutch desperately against her chest. Maka's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. His shoulder, wound from their previous encounter, tore open with the strained blood soaking his shirt, but he held on. Slowly, with every ounce of strength he had left, he hauled Hazel and the babies back onto the bridge. "I have you," he gasped. "Do not let go." "I am not letting go," Hazel said through gritted teeth. "Not of you. Not ever." Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them. A recognition that whatever happened next, they were bound together now in ways that went beyond mere survival. They reached the far side, just as the posse arrived at the near end of the bridge. Crow dismounted and began walking across, his ivory-handled Colt drawn and ready. You have nowhere left to run, Mucka, Crow shouted. Give me the ledger pages, and the woman and I will let you walk away. You have my word. Your word is worth exactly nothing, Mucka called back. Then I suppose we do this the hard way. But before Crow could take another step, a new complication arrived. One of the posse members, in his eagerness to follow, knocked over a lantern. The oil spilled onto the dry grass along the ridge grass that had been sheltered from the rain under an overhang, and fire raced along the cliff face with terrifying speed. Within seconds, flames were spreading up the slope, driven by the wind. The fire caught the bridge ropes, and Mucka realized with cold clarity that they had minutes at most before the whole thing went up. Run! He shouted to Hazel. They ran through the smoke and ash, Mucka pulling Hazel by the hand while she clutched the babies. Behind them, the bridge erupted in flames. Men shouted and scattered, and Mucka heard the ropes beginning to snap with sounds like rifle shots. The fire spread faster than any of them could have anticipated, igniting the dead grass and sage across the entire hillside. Within minutes, they were surrounded by a wall of flame on 3 sides, with the chasm at their backs. We are trapped, Hazel gasped. Mucka's mind raced. He had seen grass fires before, had learned how to survive them. We burn out a safe spot, he said quickly. Start a backfire, burn away the fuel before the main fire reaches us. It is our only chance. He struck sparks with his knife, and a piece of flint igniting a bundle of dry sage. Then he ran in an arc, spreading flames in a wide circle around their position. The backfire he created burned outward, consuming the grass and leaving a blackened patch of earth where the main fire would have nothing left to burn. They huddled in the center of that burned circle as the inferno raged around them, and the heat so intense it was hard to breathe. Hazel wrapped the babies in wet cloth to protect their lungs from smoke, and Mucka pressed them all close to the ground, where the air was marginally cooler. The fire roared past on all sides, a living thing of heat and fury. For several terrible minutes, Hazel thought they would be consumed anyway, that Mucka's desperate plan would fail, and they would die here together. Then slowly the flames moved on, racing down the hillside toward the river below. The firestorm passed, leaving them alive, in a circle of scorched earth, coughing and burned, but breathing. Through the smoke, a figure appeared. Valentine Crow, his fine coat singed and his face blackened with soot. He had somehow made it across the burning bridge before it collapsed. His ivory-handled Colt was still in his hand, and now it was pointed directly at Mucka's chest. You have cost me more trouble than you are worth, savage, Crow said, his voice shaking with rage. But this ends now. Give me those ledger pages. Mucka slowly reached into his shirt and pulled out the folded papers. He held them up where Crow could see them. This, Mucka said. This proof that you have been trafficking human beings, selling babies like cattle. Proof that I am a businessman, Crow corrected. I provide a service connecting supply with demand. Women who have nothing to offer society with families that want children. Everyone benefits. Except the women you murder when they fail to produce boys, Hazel said, her voice shaking with fury. And the children you sell like livestock. Crow's smile was cold. The frontier is hard, Mrs. Leclerc. People die. Children are orphaned. I simply facilitate transfers of custody in exchange for reasonable compensation. Nothing illegal about it. You killed Dr. Finch, Mucka said. He was helping us. You hanged him. Dr. Finch interfered in legal matters that were none of his concern, Crow said dismissively. He paid the price for that interference, just as you will pay now if you do not hand over those papers. Mucka looked at the papers in his hand, then at Crow. I will make you a deal, he said. These papers for safe passage for all of us. Crow considered this. And the woman and children, they come with me. Not acceptable. The woman is bound by contract and the children are, well, they are leverage, let us say. I will take the papers, the woman, and one of the babies as insurance against your good behavior. You can go free with the other two. That is my final offer." Maka appeared to hesitate as though considering. Then he threw the papers, but not at Crow, past him into the smoldering ashes where the wind caught them and scattered them across the burned hillside. "No." Crow lunged for the papers, and in that moment of distraction, Maka moved. But he had not told Crow everything. Hidden in the satchel with the babies wrapped carefully in oilcloth was a second set of papers, a handwritten copy of the ledger that Maka had made during their night in the schoolhouse, sitting by firelight while Hazel slept. He had given that copy to George Tiller, with instructions to take it to the telegraph shack at a mining camp on the Deadwood Trail, if Maka did not return within 3 days. 3 days had passed. The copy was already in the hands of the U.S. Marshal. Maka tackled Crow, and they went down hard in the ash. The Colt fired, but the shot went wide. They grappled trading blows, both men fighting with the desperate strength of those who know only one of them will walk away. Then Hazel was there, the Henry rifle in her hands, the weapon Maka had taught her to use. She fired once, deliberately aiming wide, but close enough that Crow flinched. In that moment of hesitation, Maka drove his fist into Crow's jaw and wrenched the ivory-handled Colt from his grip. "It is over, Crow." Maka gasped, blood running from a cut above his eye. But it was not over. From the ridge above, limping Luke appeared with his rifle raised, not aimed at Maka, but at Crow. "Sorry, Sheriff," Luke said quietly, "but some prices are just too high." He fired. The bullet took Crow in the chest, spinning him around. The sheriff stumbled backward, one hand pressed to the wound, his face a mask of shock and betrayal. "Why?" Crow gasped. "Because my cousin was Tasunke," Luke said. "Because you let his killer walk free. Because I have been waiting for someone to have the courage to stand against you, and today I finally saw it." Crow fell to his knees, then toppled sideways into the ash. He died there, his eyes open and staring at nothing, the ivory-handled Colt still clutched in his hand. Luke looked at Maka. "Get out of here, brother. There are more coming. I will hold them off as long as I can." "Come with us," Maka said. Luke shook his head. "I made my choices. I have to live with them, or die with them. Either way, it is my path. You have yours. Go." Maka gripped Luke's shoulder, once a gesture of brotherhood and forgiveness. Then he took Hazel's hand, and they ran into the smoke and ash, leaving the fire and the dead behind them. Behind them, gunfire echoed through the hills as Luke made his stand. Snow began to fall as they stumbled away from the burning hillside, soft flakes that hissed against the hot earth and slowly began to extinguish the embers. Maka was bleeding from multiple wounds, his shoulder, his side cuts on his face and hands. He moved on, sheer will holding Hazel's arm to keep her upright, because she was just as exhausted. They made it perhaps 2 miles before collapsing in a shallow cave formed by an overhang of rock. Maka could go no farther. He slumped against the stone wall, his face pale beneath the soot and blood. "You are hurt," Hazel said, her hands moving over him, assessing the damage. "Badly hurt?" "I will live," Maka said, though his voice was weak. Hazel tore strips from her already ragged dress and used them to bind his wounds, working with the skills Dr. Finch had taught her during their brief time in his cabin. Her hands shook, but her will was iron. She would not let this man die, not after everything he had done, everything he had sacrificed. As she worked, Maka's hand found hers and held it. "The papers," he said. "The copy. I gave it to George 3 days ago. He should have reached the telegraph office by now. The U.S. Marshal will come." You planned this from the beginning, Hazel said, understanding dawning. You knew we might not make it. You made sure the evidence would survive even if we did not. Always have two plans, Maka said, managing a weak smile. My grandfather taught me that. Hazel pressed her forehead against his, unable to speak, past the emotion choking her. This man, this stranger, who had appeared out of a blizzard, had given her back her life and her daughter's lives. He had risked everything, asked for nothing, and never wavered, even when death seemed certain. I do not know how to thank you, she whispered. Stay alive, Maka said. Raise your daughter strong. That will be thanks enough. And you, Hazel asked. What will you do? Maka looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. I will stay, he said simply. If you will let me, I will hunt for you. I will teach your daughters to survive in this hard country. I will stand between you and anyone who tries to harm you. Let me be their father, Hazel. Let me be the man Martin never was. Hazel felt tears slip down her cheeks, carving clean tracks through the soot and ash. You already are, she said. You have been from the moment you wrapped my smallest daughter in your cloak and warmed her with your own body. You are already their father in every way that matters. Maka pulled her close, and they held each other while the snow fell outside the cave, and the babies slept peacefully between them, unaware of how close they had all come to death. They were found 2 days later by a group of farmers led by George Tiller. George had indeed reached the telegraph shack at a mining camp on the Deadwood Trail and the U.S. Marshal, a man named Samuel Harding, who had a reputation for honesty rare on the frontier, had immediately dispatched federal deputies to arrest everyone named in the copied ledger. The farmers had been searching the hills for survivors of the fire when they found Maka and Hazel in the cave. They loaded them into a wagon with food, water, and clean blankets and took them back to Blackthorn. The town they returned to was transformed. Maud Finch had rallied the school children and their families, organizing a citizens' committee to demand investigation into Crow's activities. When Marshal Harding arrived with federal authority behind him, he found a town ready to testify. The surviving members of Crow's trafficking ring were arrested. Martin LeClaire was captured trying to flee into Wyoming, caught by bounty hunters who wanted the reward money and had no loyalty to Crow's organization. He was sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison. The full scope of the operation was revealed during the trials. 37 women over 5 years, 22 babies sold to mining camps and settlements, and at least 9 women who had disappeared after failing to deliver male children. It was a systematic operation that had preyed on desperate immigrants and hidden behind the respectability of mail-order marriage contracts. Dr. Edward Finch was buried with full honors in the Blackthorn Cemetery. The school children planted a cottonwood tree over his grave, and Maud read from the Gospel of Matthew. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Maka healed slowly but completely. Hazel tended to him, changing his bandages and making sure he ate properly, learning the Lakota remedies. He taught her poultices of sage and yarrow teas of willow bark for pain and fever. They spoke little during those days of healing, but the silence between them was comfortable and full of understanding, the easy quiet of people who had survived the worst together and no longer needed words to communicate. One evening, as spring began to break winter's hold, and the first green shoots appeared through the melting snow, Maka sat on the porch of the small cabin. Hazel had been given the cabin that had been Martin's, but was now legally hers, awarded by the territorial judge. He was carving something from a piece of cottonwood, his hands steady and sure. Hazel sat beside him, and the baby sleeping in a basket at her feet. They were growing strong now, all 3 of them, their tiny faces filling out and their lungs clear and powerful. "What are you making?" she asked. A cradleboard, Maka said, showing her the intricate frame he was constructing. For carrying babies safely on your back while you work. My people have used them for generations. It is beautiful, Hazel said, running her fingers over the smooth wood. Maka set down the cradleboard and reached into a bundle beside him. He pulled out 3 items and then placed them carefully on the porch between them. A pair of moccasins sewn from soft deerskin decorated with careful beadwork. A length of elk sinew braided into a bracelet, and the cradleboard itself. In my tradition, Maka said quietly, these gifts represent a man's intentions. The moccasins mean I will walk beside you. The sinew means I will bind myself to you and your family. The cradleboard means I will help you carry what must be carried. He looked at her directly, his dark eyes serious. I want to be their father, Hazel. Not in law, I know the world makes that complicated for men like me and women like you. But in truth, in action, I will hunt for you. I will teach your daughters to survive in this country. I will mend what breaks and defend what needs defending. I will stand between you and harm for as long as I draw breath. Will you let me do this? Hazel felt her heart break open in a way she had never experienced, not with romantic foolishness, but with something deeper and more real. This was a man who had proven his worth through actions, not words. Who had saved her life and her daughters' lives without expectation of reward. Who was offering not grand promises, but practical partnership in a hard land. You do not need to ask, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You have already done all of those things. You are already their father in every way that matters. Then let it be official, Maka said. He took her hand and pressed something into her palm, a ring carved from bone, simple and beautiful. We will marry in the eyes of my people, he said. And if the white man's law will allow it, we will marry in their eyes too. But what matters is this: we choose each other. We build something together. We survive together. Hazel slipped the ring onto her finger and then pulled Maka close, kissing him for the first time, a kiss that tasted of smoke and snow and survival, of 2 souls finding each other in the wilderness and choosing to walk forward together. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. They were married by Maud Finch in a ceremony that blended frontier practicality with Lakota tradition. Maka wore his best buckskins and his grandfather's bone necklace. Hazel wore a dress of simple blue calico that Anna Tiller had sewn for her and moccasins that Maka had made with his own hands. George and Anna Tiller stood as witnesses, along with 24 townspeople who had once shunned Maka, but now called him friend. The babies were present too, wrapped in blankets and watching the proceedings with solemn eyes. The territorial judge who presided over Crow's trial attended the wedding and gave them his blessing, though he warned them that not everyone would accept a marriage between a white woman and a Lakota man. Some places would call them criminals for even attempting it. Some people would treat their children as half-breed outcasts. Let them try, Maka said quietly. We have survived worse. The final revelation came a month later, when the federal marshals were cataloging the documents seized from Crow's office. Buried in a desk drawer was a pre-signed bill of sale dated 3 months before Hazel had even given birth. It authorized the sale of 1 male child to a buyer in Deadwood with payment to be delivered upon confirmation of healthy arrival. The document proved what Maka and Hazel had suspected, even if Hazel had given birth to a son, Martin, and Crow would have taken him. The entire contract had been designed to produce children for sale, regardless of the mother's desires or rights. When Hazel saw the document, she felt rage and grief, in equal measure rage at the calculated cruelty of it. and grief for all the women and children who had passed through Crow's hands before she had been lucky enough to find a man willing to fight for her. Maka took the document and fed it to the fire in their hearth, watching it curl and blacken and turn to ash. "It is over," he said. "They will never harm you or anyone else again." The trafficking ring was dismantled over the following months. Federal marshals tracked down the buyers and recovered 11 children, including 3 infants, who were reunited with their mothers. The rest were placed with families who agreed to formal adoptions, supervised by territorial courts, to ensure the children were actually wanted and cared for, not simply purchased as labor or worse. Maka never found his sister Wichapi. The trail led to Deadwood, but there it went cold. The buyer named in the ledger had died 2 years prior, and no one knew what had become of the young Lakota woman he had purchased. But Maka planted a willow tree on their homestead in her memory, and he told his adopted daughters stories about their aunt, how she had been brave and kind and clever, and how she deserved to be remembered, even though she was lost. "Maybe someday someone will find her," Hazel said, holding Maka's hand as they stood beside the young willow. "Or maybe she found her own freedom, her own life somewhere. We can hope for that." "Yes," Maka said. "We can hope." They built a life together on the homestead that the territorial judge had awarded to Hazel, free and clear of any claims from Martin Leclerc or his associates. The land was hard but honest, in the way frontier land always was, demanding constant work, but yielding enough to survive if you were willing to sweat and bleed for it. Maka taught Hazel how to trap beaver and muskrat, how to cure hides, and prepare meat for the long winters. Hazel taught Maka to read and write English tracing letters in the dirt with sticks, until he could write his name and hers, and eventually could read the newspapers that came from Denver. The 3 daughters grew strong and healthy under their combined care. They learned to speak both English and Lakota, moving easily between the 2 worlds their parents had forged together. Maud Finch taught them reading and arithmetic at the schoolhouse. Maka taught them to track animals and read weather signs to know which plants were good for medicine and which would kill you if you were foolish enough to eat them. They wore the moccasins Maka made for them, soft deerskin that moved silently through the forest, and they learned to shoot straight and ride hard and stand up for themselves and others. They grew into young women who were tough and capable and kind, who understood that survival and compassion were not opposites, but partners in the hard work of living. One summer afternoon, when the oldest daughter was 7 years old, they were working by the river when they heard a cry for help. A young boy, the son of homesteaders from the next valley, had fallen into the current and was being swept downstream toward rapids that would surely kill him. Maka dove into the water without hesitation, swimming with powerful strokes to reach the struggling child. Hazel threw him a rope, and together they pulled the boy to safety. Maka using his strength, Hazel using her weight as an anchor, working in perfect coordination, born of years of partnership. The boy's parents arrived minutes later, having followed his cries. They were beside themselves with gratitude and relief. "You saved our son," the father said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "How can we ever repay you?" "No payment needed," Maka said, wringing water from his shirt. "We help each other out here. That is how we all survive." As the family rode away, their rescued son wrapped in blankets and safe, Hazel took Maka's hand and squeezed it gently. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Staying with us, you could have gone north to your people lived the way you were raised. Instead, you are here tied to a white woman and her children dealing with townspeople who will never fully accept you." Maka looked at her, really looked the way he had that first night in the blizzard when he had found her kneeling in the snow. His eyes held the same steady certainty they had held then. "Regret?" He shook his head slowly. "No, never." I have found more in this life with you than I ever had alone in the high country. I have purpose. I have family. I have daughters to raise and a woman who stands beside me as an equal partner." He touched her face gently. How could I regret any of that? Even with the difficulty, the prejudice, the hard looks, and harder words. "Scars are proof that we fought for something worth having," Maka said. "And that we won. Let them look and let them talk. We know who we are and what we have built together. That is enough." Hazel leaned into him, and they stood together, watching their daughters play by the river, secure in the knowledge that they had survived the worst the frontier could throw at them, and come out stronger on the other side. Years passed. The daughters grew. The homestead prospered. Maka's hair began to show threads of silver, and Hazel developed the weathered look of women who had spent their lives working under the sun and wind. People still asked sometimes about the girl's father, usually newcomers to the territory who did not know the story. Hazel's answer never changed. Their father, she would say, looking at Maka as he worked in the field or taught one of the girls to string a bow or stood on the porch watching the sunset. "He is the one who stayed when everyone else ran. He is the one who fought for us when we had no one. He is the one who chose us and whom we chose in return." And that she knew was the only answer that mattered. On quiet evenings when the work was done and the daughters were asleep, Maka and Hazel would sit on their porch and watch the stars wheel overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first desperate flight through the blizzard, that had shone down on their battles and their survival and their slow building of something solid and good. "We made it," Hazel would say, sometimes still marveling at the simple fact of their survival. "We made more than that," Maka would reply. "We made a life worth living. We made a family worth fighting for. We made something that will outlast us both." And that was the truest thing either of them could say.